Hello and welcome to another tutorial. So someone asked me how to remake a distorted 808 that was in the intro to one of my tutorials. So that's what I'll be doing today. Here it is. Every sound in this tutorial, aside from the low kick and the 808, are included in either my preset or sample packs, which are available in the description. I'll also make the rack used in this video available in the description, but you'll have to add your own 808. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this content. Just going to start by finding the 808 I've used here. If I click on it, you can hear that it's just a pretty normal 808 with a long tail. So we're going to create a new MIDI track in order to remake the sound. So that's Control-Shift-T on Windows or Command-Shift-T on Mac. We can then drag the MIDI into the new channel and delete the original track. And we can drag the sample into the channel. Next, we'll want to turn the track down by around 10 dB. And I'm also going to color code and rename it. We also want to change the voices to 1, so simpler is monophonic. This is because multiple bass notes overlapping sounds very messy. I'll play some bass notes at the same time so you can hear what I mean. We can now tune the kick, and I always like my kicks to play from C. So let's bring a tuner in. It's Control or Command F to search. Type in tuner. And now it's on the channel. I'm going to go into the controls. And first, we're going to increase the sense to get the long part of the 808 in tune. So that looks better. And now we can increase the transposition by 5 because at the moment it's a G. And if we increase it by 5 semitones, I'm playing a C in the middle of the keyboard. And you can see that that is now at a C. Now we can start to process the sound. The multi-band method I use is fairly complex because I'm using quite a long chain. So don't hesitate to rewatch parts of the video if you're finding it difficult to follow along. The first thing we are going to do is split the frequency bands. This means that we can process different frequency ranges in different ways. And for example, that I can keep the sub-frequencies clean and consistent. I'm going to group simpler to itself using Control G. Then I'm going to click this button here, which will reveal the chains. And I'm going to duplicate the instance of Serum within the channel using Control D or Command D on Mac. Now we can start to split the frequencies using EQ3. So I'm going to search for one and drag it onto the channel. Now we can rename the chains within this instrument rack as sub and top. Normally, I tend to split the low frequencies at 100 Hertz and the high frequencies at 700 Hertz when it comes to processing basses in this way. And we can drag this in to the instrument rack and turn off the bands which are not specific to the frequency area of the chain. So if we drag this on to the sub, we can turn off the mid and high bands. And on the top, we can leave the mid and the high bands turned on. It's Control or Command drag to duplicate, which is how I got this instance on the sub chain. Now we need to go back to the top chain and split the bands inside this chain. So again, group the EQ to itself and duplicate it within the channel. And we can rename this mid and high. And then we can turn off the bands not required. So the mid for the mids stays on and the high for the high stays on. Now that we've split the frequencies, we can start to process the sound. We're going to compress the sub layer to ensure that it's more consistent. So I'll drag in this compressor. Make sure to drag in the compressor before the EQ, as otherwise you can get some audible distortion, especially if you're using quite heavy compression that we'll be using here. Solo the chain. We'll take the makeup off. We'll change the release time to auto. Usually I use quite a fast attack because I want the compression to happen quickly. And I also tend to use quite a high ratio to try and ensure that we keep the sub consistent. We can start to tweak the other parameters as well. I've experimented with using both peak and RMS, but if you want to maintain the transient of the 808, I'd suggest using RMS. But if you want the sound to be very consistent, I'd recommend using peak. Usually I use RMS because it can be smoother, but I think here I'm gonna use peak. Just listen for the difference. You can hear that peak squashes the transient a bit. And in this case, I think I'm going to go for peak. And we'll do a little before and after. You can hear that the tail lasts longer with the compression and that the sub feels more consistent. We can now turn our attention to the top channel. Before we start to distort the 808, we can increase the spread function in the controls to 100%. This creates two different voices, which are slightly out of tune with one another and are panned to either side. I'm then going to drag in a mono utility plugin to the midband, meaning that these detuned signals combine and start to phase with each other, creating some movement. The movement will become more obvious as we start to add distortion. The reason we don't increase the spread for the sub is because it makes the sub less consistent, and that's not what we want in this case. Now for the distortion, I'm going to drag in a saturator in between simpler and the mid and high split chains within the top chain. So this will be easier for me to show you visually than explain it. We want to push this plugin to the maximum value, but make sure to turn the output down so that it won't clip. You can hear it starting to get closer to what we want. We can now add overdrive plugins to the mid and high bands to distort them individually. And this is something that we can tweak to taste. And now we can add some EQ. We are going to take away the very lowest frequencies. There's not a huge amount of very high frequency information here. But because heavy saturation can create nasty frequencies in the high end, I'm just going to roll it off in order to ensure that none of those frequencies are present. I might also do a little dip around 600, just so the 808 sounds less nasal. And I'm also going to add an instance of isotope alloy 2 to mono below 2 kilohertz. I've already done this with the mid chain, but this is to ensure things are as mono compatible as possible for club contexts. And I have some reverb on a send, which I'm going to send the 808 to, and we can do this in the mix. And yeah, that's it. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll see you again next time.